Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 26th, where we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I trust you have finished watching the performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream. As you know, every performance is an interpretation, and no performance is a substitute for reading the text. So my hope is that you have also concluded reading the text and that you are in the midst of reading our next text, which happens to also be a comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. And it is very much a comedy that's set in reality as opposed to A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is set in fantasy. And one of the things I think you'll find with A Midsummer Night's Dream and all of the plays that we're talking about this semester is that many of the themes that we discussed in the sonnets will be reappearing. So I wanted to talk about some of the major elements of the play, and that begins with the significance of the title. And you can see that I've got notes below this video as well. And a midsummer wouldn't necessarily be the middle of the summer. This would basically be a pagan holiday, and that would be the spring equinox or the summer equinox, and ultimately that would be the longest day of the year, which happens to be in late June. And it also, from a pagan perspective, was one of the most sexually charged holidays of the year, which is important because we have the contrast of the importance of virginity in this play, as well as the idea of the bawdiness and the eroticism that also is present in the play. Not unusual for Shakespeare. Midsummer, there are also references to May Day, May 1st, which is also another pagan holiday, which is associated with basically also fertility and one of the most sexually charged days of the year. In fact, if you know anything about May Day celebrations from a pagan perspective, the maypole was supposed to serve as a phallic symbol. It's one of the reasons why the insult painted maypole that Hermia hurls at Helena is so horrible. Maypole would be in reference to a phallus, and painted would be in reference to a false face, to wearing makeup. So basically, she has just called her former best friend, or she's just insulted her former best friend by calling her both a phallus and a kind of prostitute because of wearing makeup. So nighttime, of course, you can think about the times of the day as symbolic, and certainly night represents descent, and it also allows the opportunity for sexual union. And of course, this idea of dream and that love itself is like a dream. And if you think about some of the parallels, we talk about that we fall in love as well as we also fall asleep, and that it's something that can't be controlled, and it's something that can be terrible as in a nightmare, or something that can be wonderful as much like love can be terrible or wonderful. And obviously, this play is about the difficulties and conflicts one can experience in love relationship, and no one is immune. Notice that Shakespeare gives us a multitude of characters, and all of these characters represent different ages, different socioeconomic stages, and ultimately, all of them experience difficulties in love. The idea that the play focuses on magic is also in reference to the idea that love itself can be magical, and much like a spell, that when one is in love, one is no longer able to be reasonable or rational or even see clearly. Love is both exhilarating and humiliating, as we see with Titania at one point, who falls in love with Bottom, a literal and figurative ass, because love is blind. And we also see different levels of love, things like unrequited love, which is a common aspect of love. We see things like engagement, which is what we are introduced to in the beginning of the play with Theseus and Hippolyta. And in the performance we saw, the actors who play Theseus and Hippolyta also play Oberon and Titania. So the king and queen of the humans are also the king and queen of the fairy world. One of the reasons why you'd have the same actors perform multiple roles, well, certainly during the time of the Renaissance, it was a money saving device, but it also illustrates the connection or the parallel between the human king and queen and the fairy king and queen. And this goes to show that king and queens in both the human and the fairy world can experience difficulties in love. We certainly see how nobles can experience difficulties in love as well, with things like Hermia and Helena and Demetrius and Lysander facing their own love difficulties. So, that said, whether or not you've got a married couple, which is what you would have with the fairy king and queen, engaged couple, which is what you would have with Theseus and Hippolyta, or a dating couple, if you will, or couples, as you have with the human nobles, Hermia and Lysander and Demetrius and Helena. You can see that all of these couplings and the subsequent couplings afterwards illustrate some of the difficulties associated with love. Notice that the play first begins in the city, which is supposed to represent civilization and order and the rules of mankind. And then we shift our setting into the forest, which is supposed to represent nature, or the wilderness, that which is wild and untamed. We have a play that's set in Athens. It was not unusual for Shakespeare to set his plays in exotic locales, but outside of the setting of the exotic locale, it may as well have been in England proper itself. And some of the interesting things about this play include the portrayal of female. And we also see within this play a play within a play. And that is not unusual for Shakespeare, oftentimes to be very meta in his approach to make commentary about what he's giving. And we see a certain level of darkness in this comedy. In fact, we'll see even more darkness in Much Ado About Nothing, which will be very similar to a tragedy that we will be talking about when we get to the tragedy section, Othello. So there are a lot of parallels. And one of the questions I asked you is, who is your favorite character, or at least who was your favorite actor portrayal? Those are two different questions. Obviously, having a favorite character in the play would be influenced by the actor's portrayal, and I wanted to illustrate the idea that, yes, Shakespeare was meant to be performed, but obviously each performance is going to be unique and have its own strengths and weaknesses. The performance that I asked us to see was in the Shakespearean Globe Theater. So you've already got some very skilled actors with an environment that's supposed to simulate on some level what a Shakespearean audience would have had. I know many of you indicated that you found the audience's responses distracting, but keep in mind that if you are watching a live performance, then ultimately you have to be willing to sacrifice or to experience the audience's reactions, whether they be good or bad. And it would not at all have been unusual for the actors to interact with the audience. Audiences were quite rowdy during the time of Shakespeare. Think about something like a sporting event in contemporary times, which is probably a little bit more accurate to what you would experience. Puck tends to be a perennial favorite, at least in terms of characters. Ask any actor, and they probably want to play Puck or Bottom because of the comedic possibilities. I'm not so sure that I'm the biggest fan. Actually, I am sure I'm not the biggest fan of the actor playing Puck. I've seen better Pucks in other productions. I personally like the actor playing Bottom very much. I think it's quite comedic. But of course, this is a subjective question. As you know, I like to ask subjective questions in our discussion forum. It's less about the answer and it's more about your interpretation and your response. And you can see that while you're not required to respond to your peers, you are required to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn so that you can get a good sense of what we would have talked about during a class discussion. Now, the plot is notoriously confusing, in part because love is notoriously confusing. And I have detailed the plot in the second section in the notes below, that we are first introduced to King Theseus and Queen Hippolyta. They are engaged, and notice that Theseus has conquered Hippolyta in war. This is a kind of typical love. It is a political union. Notice that the theme of power relationships in love is a major theme in this particular drama. And in terms of how we're supposed to respond to Theseus and Hippolyta, Hippolyta being the queen of the Amazons, a very strong female warrior race, obviously this idea of being conquered by Theseus is not something that is of appeal to her. There are definitely power and gender issues going on in this particular play. However, as a comedy, we know that what we need to expect is a happy ending, which means no death and at least the promise of marriage, if not marriage itself. And one assumes that by the ending of the play, Theseus and Hippolyta are happily united. And it would not have been unusual at the time of the Renaissance to assume that love would come after marriage, not necessarily before marriage. Hermia and Lysander are a dating couple. They're quite happy with one another, but their conflict happens to be Hermia's father, who does not approve of their relationship and would want his daughter to be with his choice, which happens to be Demetrius. Now, Lysander and Demetrius are pretty equal in terms of temperament and position, so there really isn't a good reason for the father to want what he wants outside of the fact that he's the father. Or if you've heard the expression with somebody in power, if you've questioned them saying, because I said so, then perhaps you can understand the dynamic that's going on here. And Hermia, as a female daughter, no less, would be seen as property, her father's property, and eventually would become her husband's property. So the idea that she dares to defy her father is a very atypical sort of situation for the Renaissance, where a daughter was expected to follow her father's orders. And the fact that Hermia gets her way by the ending of the play is, I think, one of Shakespeare's ways of being somewhat subversive. But as I talked about, don't expect easy answers from Shakespeare. So if you're looking for all of the female characters to get their way, that isn't exactly what happens in this play. Much like real life, things are much more complicated. We are introduced also to another coupling, Helena and Demetrius, and they represent unrequited and fickle love. Prior to the play, Demetrius had loved Helena, but he's changed his mind, which goes to show how fickle love can be. And worse, he's decided that he's fallen in love with Hermia, and Hermia just happens to be Helena's best friend. So that will lead to possible tensions that we will see in Act 3. In fact, one of the commentaries of the play is that love can destroy friendships, the competition of love. And Demetrius and Lysander might seem very similar in terms of their temperament. In fact, I had a professor in college both say they were jerks. But Hermia and Helena seem to be quite different, even though their names both start with H, again, leading to opportunity for confusing these two characters, which is what Shakespeare wants to do in terms of his commentary about love, that one's lover is just as good as another's lover, and that they could be easily interchanged with one another. It's one of the reasons why it's easy to get these characters mixed up. Shakespeare wanted to reinforce that idea. The physical appearance between the two women are quite different, however. Hermia is short and dark, by dark meaning dark hair and dark eyes, much like the dark lady that we talked about in Shakespearean sonnets. Helena is tall and blonde, and by the stereotypes and the assumptions of the time period, the tall blonde should get all the attention. So you can imagine the tension between the two friends when it's the short brunette that has both men who are interested in her, and the tall blonde has no one interested in her. At least that's the way our play begins. And we know that Demetrius at this point wants to be with Hermia. Hermia does not want to be with Demetrius. Of course, she wants to be with Lysander. Then we're introduced to Fairy Oberon and Queen Titania, who are fairies and are married, and they are arguing very much a power struggle over a changeling child. Now, Shakespeare would have used much of the fairy and pagan folklore of the time, so there was such a thing as a changeling. And the fairy folklore of that is that a changeling would be a child that was basically a human child that would be substituted with a fairy child in the middle of the night. That fairies would steal the human child and leave the fairy child, and that fairy child would probably have some sort of challenge or deformity. It's why the parents would be able to say that this is not their biological child, this is a changeling, this is a fairy child. And that idea is what Shakespeare used, but he would change it for dramatic purposes. So what we're introduced to with the changeling is less of about a human child being substituted with a fairy child, and it's about basically a child that Queen Titania is raising because she feels obligated because the child's mother, one of her serving women, died in childbirth. Regardless, what we see is a power struggle. Fairy Oberon, as the husband, basically demands that Titania give over the changeling. Oberon doesn't have a good reason outside of because I said so. Titania dares to say no. In fact, she has forsworn his marriage bed, so she's denied him intimate relations. So what this means is that Oberon has decided that he is going to enact revenge. And while Titania shows herself to be a strong female at the beginning by defying her husband, much like Hermia defies her father, at the ending of the play, Titania does not get her way. In fact, she is debased and humiliated through magical love juice. And ultimately, she falls in love with the first thing she sees, which happens to be Bottom, who's not only a laborer and an idiot, but at this point has been transformed through magic into a literal bottom or ass. And Bottom and his cohorts were introduced to at the beginning of the play, kind of comedic relief. They're rehearsing a play about love. Again, that gives Shakespeare the opportunity to be very meta when we see the play within a play. King Theseus is basically the highest order of the land, and Hermia's father Aegeus appeals to Theseus to please make his daughter listen to him. And King Theseus basically tells Hermia, obey your father and marry the man that your father wants, or face a nunnery or death. And both would be considered equally horrific. However, King Theseus gives Hermia some time to contemplate what she's going to do. Of course, this is a necessary plot device so that we can have the unfolding of the play that occurs. But it also perhaps shows a little bit of empathy on King Theseus's part. After all, he has his own love difficulties. And he's in a terrible political situation where he has to make a decision that's going to anger someone. And perhaps if he gives Hermia time to think about it, then perhaps the situation will resolve on its own, and then King Theseus isn't going to have to make a decision. It's one of the things that politicians tend to fear, trying to make decisions, because ultimately a decision will alienate somebody. Hermia and Lysander decide to do what what many young couples decide to do when they are denied love. They're going to run away together. They run away to the woods, again, leaving Athens and civilization to the untamed wilderness when they go into the woods. And of course, before they leave, Hermia tells her best friend, Helena, what they plan to do. Not very smart. And what Helena decides to do is to tell Demetrius. And this shows how irrational Helena's thinking is at this point, that she hopes that if she tells Demetrius that his love, Hermia, has run away with another man, Demetrius will be so indebted to Helena that he'll love her again, as he did prior to the play. Again, completely irrational, but we're not very smart when we're in love. One of the many themes of the play. So basically, Demetrius decides to go into the woods and chase after Hermia. And that means Helena is going to go into the woods as well and chase after them, which means that we've got all of our major characters in the woods. Bottom and his cohorts decide that they're going to rehearse their play about love in the woods stating that they want some privacy. You can decide whether you agree that's a good reason or not, but Shakespeare has basically moved many of the major characters into the woods so that we can have the action unfold there. Of course, the fairies live in the woods, and this is where Fairy Oberon unveils his scheme to Puck. Notice Puck is the only character who goes through the play without a love relationship, or the only major character who goes through the play without a love relationship. So perhaps that means that Puck can be a little bit more reasonable and rational because he's not manipulated by love. And Fairy Oberon has a scheme in which to distract his wife, Fairy Titania, so that she no longer cares about the changeling. And that means that Fairy Oberon can take that changeling boy. And the idea is that Puck will put some love juice into Fairy Titania's eyes. She will fall in love with the first thing she sees. And of course, when we're in love, we no longer care about things we cared about in the past, such as changelings. That's another theme that Shakespeare is giving us. In addition, Fairy Oberon decides to help Helena because he's overheard some of the love difficulties that Helena is experiencing. So Fairy Oberon orders Puck to put the love juice on the eyes of the man wearing the Athenian garb so that he loves Helena once again. Why? Well, certainly it's a plot device so that we can have some misunderstandings. And again, it can perhaps show that there are other characters who feel empathy when it comes to love difficulties. In this instance, Fairy Oberon, feeling perhaps a little bit of empathy for Helena, because after all, Fairy Oberon has his own love problems. And again, notice that the same actors who play King Theseus and Queen Titania also play Fairy Oberon, or King Theseus, I'm sorry, and Queen Hippolyta also play Fairy Oberon and Fairy Titania to illustrate the parallels between these two. So on his own, because Puck is known as a mischievous spirit fairy. In fact, there is a Puck, or a Robin Goodfellow is his other name, that exists in fairy folklore, that's known for being not evil, but mischievous. Puck decides on his own to turn Bottom, who's rehearsing his play, into an ass. Bottom acts like an ass, and he talks like an ass, so he may as well be turned into an ass. Fairy Titania, when she awakes after the love juice, the first thing she sees is Bottom the ass. Things couldn't have worked better. So not only does this illustrate that love is blind, that one could fall in love with an ass, but it also illustrates how not only is Oberon able to distract his wife so he can take the changeling, but he's able to humiliate her as well. Puck mistakenly, and I've put this in quotation marks in the notes below, puts a love juice on Lysander rather than Demetrius. So now Lysander loves Helena instead of Hermia. And this goes to show how actor interpretation is so important, because Puck has been instructed to put the love juice on the man wearing the Athenian garb. So there are two men wearing Athenian garb, Demetrius and Lysander. This could be an innocent mistake, as Puck claims. However, we know that Puck is also mischievous, so Puck could have known what his orders were and decided to defy them, just for merely the entertainment possibilities that could result. So a lot of that will be dependent on how the actor decides to play the lines. It's one of the reasons I think, again, why Puck is an actor favorite, because there's a certain level of interpretation there. Now, when Puck is confronted with this, he, quote, rectifies, unquote, his mistake by putting the love juice on Demetrius's eyes. But Puck never removes the love juice from Lysander's eyes. So that means we have two men under the influence of love juice who are both in love with Helena. This is the exact opposite of how we began the play, with two men in love with Hermia, which leads to all kinds of possibilities with anger and conflict between these two friends, these best friends, who become former best friends in Act 3, Helena and Hermia, as they are arguing over love relationships. And the fact that now both men love Helena, the tall blonde, reinforcing societal expectations, rather than Hermia, the short brunette, leads additional possibilities for conflict. Eventually, we do need resolution, however. This is a comedy, so it has to end happily. The love juice is removed from Lysander's eyes, so now he returns to loving Hermia. The love juice remains on Demetrius's eyes, so now he remains loving Helena, which is how things were prior to the play. And this is considered a happy ending. I don't know how I would feel if I were Demetrius and I were being manipulated, but the idea that Demetrius did pledge himself to Helena prior to the play would be considered a kind of restoration of order. The love juice is removed from Titania's eyes, but only after the changeling is taken from her. And she has to come to the realization that I loved an ass, literally and figuratively. Against Shakespeare's question to us as audience, how many of us have fallen in love with an ass and not realized it because love is blind? And the donkey spell is removed from Bottom, so he returns to human form, but he still acts like an ass. And there would be some sexual references here. The audience would have been well aware that the ass or the donkey would be considered the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So there's all kinds of possibility here for bawdy statements. And I think we saw that in the production from the Globe Theater, that they made it pretty obvious that the relationship between Bottom and Titania was consummated. Some of the performances are more obvious about that, and some are less obvious about that. Ultimately, we need to return to King Theseus because he needed to make a decision, and he's decided that since the couples are happy, the nobles, that ultimately Hermia and Lysander and Hermia are in love, and Helena and Demetrius and Helena are in love, that he's going to leave them the way they are. This is probably the best of all possible outcomes because the only person who's upset is Aegeus. He doesn't get his way, but the young lovers do get their way, which again is somewhat subversive, perhaps, when you think about the chain of being and the idea of how elders were considered to be those in power over youth. It would seem that the play could end here, but it doesn't. We have an Act 5. And what we get is that ridiculous play within a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, that seems to just be tacked on. But trust me, nothing is just tacked on with Shakespeare. That is very much a play that comments on what we've just seen about love and all of the conflicts associated with love. In fact, Pyramus and Thisbe is supposed to be a tragedy, which illustrates how easily A Midsummer Night's Dream could have been a tragedy as well. Could have ended in death. But ultimately, of course, we have resolution. So in Act 3, the lovers don't come to blows with one another. And it also provides Shakespeare a wonderful opportunity to provide commentary about his competitors, because Pyramus and Thisbe is a wonderful example of poor writing and poor acting. Basically, what Shakespeare is trying to show us is what his competitors are putting out: poor acting and poor writing. So from Shakespeare's perspective, he's already shown us greatness in the first 4 acts. He shows us absurdity with the Pyramus and Thisbe production and leaves the question up to us: do we want to spend our time and money watching inferior performances such as Pyramus and Thisbe, or do we want to continue to watch great performances? Therefore, we invest our time and money in Shakespearean productions. There's also a lot of humor and bawdiness. You lose a lot of the physical humor when you're just reading the play, one of the many reasons why you need to see a performance. And comedies were filled with music and dance, in part because they were supposed to be entertainment vehicles, oftentimes performed immediately before or after a wedding ceremony. So again, I think in the performance we saw, and many performances, you'll see lots of music and dance that will obviously lengthen the performance, though there would probably be an intermission around Act 3 or so. Makes a certain level of sense. But that's the entertainment value. I personally think that the very ending of this performance that I had us watch from the Globe is absolutely awe-inspiring and breathtaking. When you have all of the actors singing, it still sends chills up and down my spine. So I think that's quite gorgeous. Of course, we could debate about some of the choices that they made to modernize the production. Having Bottom and his cohorts, for instance, tap dancing with clogs, which I think it's quite entertaining. I don't know if it's historically accurate. Certainly, some of the music is not historically accurate. You might have noticed a few bars from Queen's "We Will Rock You." But or the moonwalk, of course, that we see in the competition between Quince and Bottom. That said, I think that helps to just make the play more accessible to contemporary audiences, and which is what Shakespeare would have done with his own audience. Really, Shakespearean plays were the television of the day, and they needed to appeal to a wide range of audiences. It's one of the reasons why you've got multiple levels in Shakespearean plays. So they would appeal to the young and the old, the rich and the poor, the educated and the non educated. You get the idea. So, notice that as the characters are watching Pyramus and Thisbe, they never once relate their own idiocies associated with love to the Pyramus and Thisbe story, which shows their lack of insight, how little they have learned because previously they themselves were acting like idiots in love. But of course, all of these are actors and none of this is real. The message is for us as audience that if we're watching this production, both the play within a play and also just the grander play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we are entertained and we find humor, but we never once stop to see how it reflects our own idiocy when it comes to love, then we've learned nothing. We have as much of a lack of insight as the actual characters do as well. So that's what makes some of Shakespearean plays somewhat uncomfortable, is because they expose our own follies and our own weaknesses. But at least Shakespeare is equal opportunity and is willing to do that with everyone, himself included. Puck's final speech is nothing short of brilliant and it's also one of the most famous speeches in A Midsummer Night's Dream, because not only does it allow the character of Puck to apologize if anyone was offended, and by this point, just about everybody can be offended in one way or another who is watching this play, based on the way that we're portrayed, we being all of us, as idiots in love. But it also provides the opportunity for the actor playing Puck to apologize, and on a grander scale, for Shakespeare himself as playwright to apologize for any offense that might have been taken. And in fact, Puck has oftentimes been seen as a kind of Shakespeare-like character. Puck is oftentimes seen like Shakespeare himself, someone who's controlling and manipulating all of the action. Again, interesting commentary about power. I mean, it's supposed to be Fairy Oberon who basically is in power and is ordering Puck, and yet without Puck, I wonder how much of any of this could have happened. Again, I think of modern day parallels where in, let's say, an office, for instance, or a company, for instance, the president of the company or the CEO is supposed to be the one in power, but it's really the administrative assistant who is making everything happen. And I think there's some parallels there as well. So, in terms of the notes below, you can see that in the third section, I've sort of detailed different acts. Act 1, where we're introduced to midsummer, that pagan summer solstice that I was telling you about, the idea of night and the darkness of mystery associated with it, the idea of dream, that love is like a dream, that Athens is civilization and order, that it's no mistake that Hippolyta is the queen of the Amazons, a strong female warrior race, and Theseus, the Athens ruler, has conquered Hippolyta in war. Hermia being our short brunette who defies her father Aegeus. Helena being the tall blonde who has unrequited love for Demetrius. Bonham and his cohorts rehearsing the play within a play about love, Pyramus and Thisbe. Oberon, the fairy king, arguing with fairy queen about the changeling boy. Fairy Titania has forsworn her marriage bed, and Aegeus, at a loss, appeals to King Theseus, the highest power in the land, and Theseus gives Hermia time to consider her options. So in Act 1, what we're introduced to are themes such as love being fickle, arranged versus romantic relationships, and power struggle in relationship. In Act 2 is when we're introduced to the forest, which is wild and untamed. This is where Hermia and Lysander run away. This is where Helena, unfortunately, tells Demetrius, without necessarily her smartest move, And this is a wonderful way to get all these characters in the forest: Helena, Demetrius, Hermia, and Lysander. But it also shows how love can interfere with reasoning, because if Helena was thinking clearly, she never would have told Demetrius what Hermia's plans were. Bonham and cohorts are rehearsing again in the forest, which allows some of the comic misunderstandings to occur when Oberon orders Puck to use the love juice on Fairy Titania, and also on the man wearing the Athenian garb. So, of course, this allows Puck the opportunity to put the love juice on the wrong man, which he does. Puck transforms Bottom into an ass, because why not? Bottom acts like an ass. Poor actor, poor writer, but he thinks very highly of himself, Bottom does. Titania falls in love with Bottom the ass, because oftentimes we do fall in love with asses. Lysander now loves Helena, and Puck, in rectifying the situation, puts the love juice on Demetrius, but does not remove the love juice from Lysander. So now both men, Lysander and Demetrius, love Helena, the tall blonde, not Hermia. So in this act, we see how love is irrational and humiliating, and love acts like a magical spell where we have no control. And in Act 3, this is what I call the catfight scene. This is where best friends Helena and Hermia fight with one another and hurl insults, and Demetrius and Lysander join the fight. If this was a tragedy, this is where we would begin to get some murders, but it isn't a tragedy, it's a comedy. But what we get in Act 3 are the conflicts about love, and how love can destroy friendships, and how love is blind. Act 4, rather than getting the beginning of resolution, which is what we usually see in a Shakespearean comedy, is where we actually get resolution and our happy ending, where Hermia and Lysander get their way as a couple, and Helena and Demetrius return to a pre-play coupling, a sort of viewing of restoration of order. Fairy Oberon gets the changeling boy, so this sort of complicates the narrative that female has power in this play. Even someone like Helena is quite interesting in that she's quite passive. She says, treat me like your dog, your cur, as she's following someone. We would call this stalking in contemporary times, who doesn't want her anymore. Yet, as she says, women were not made to woo, and yet she takes the role of active pursuer and gets her own way. So even Helena is seen as somewhat complicated, with having strength and weakness. Certainly Hermia, strength in defying her father and getting her way at the end. Titania defying her husband but not getting her way in the end, and in fact being humiliated along the way. And of course, Titania has to realize that she was in love with an ass. As we see, love is complicated, it's unpredictable, and it's surprising. And then we get that wonderful Act 5, the play within a play, Pyramus and Thisbe, which should remind you of another Shakespearean tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, which would have been written around the same time, scholars believe, as A Midsummer Night's Dream. That play within a play is not unusual for Shakespeare. We see the lack of insight the characters have when they are watching Pyramus and Thisbe, reinforcing that we ourselves, in watching A Midsummer Night's Dream, might also have a lack of insight and have not been able to acknowledge how we too can be fools when it comes to love. Shakespeare will show, not just tell, but show us bad acting and bad writing in Pyramus and Thisbe, a dig at his competition, and Puck, or perhaps Shakespeare's, apology, which seems rather insincere, because after all, Puck says, as I am an honest Puck. And we know Puck is not honest, so one wonders if that just negates the entire apology. And Act 5 shows us that love is ignorant, stupid, and fun. So some themes: that love makes everyone, regardless of age or status, an idiot. That love destroys friendships. Love is like a magic spell or like a dream. And beauty need not be tall and blonde. We saw that also with the sonnets. Females can, at least sometimes, defy powerful male figures, as we see in Midsummer Night's Dream. And that virginity is so important for these females, as they reference this, that they are both virgins. It's one of the reasons why Hermia tells Lysander to let further off when they're in the woods because she doesn't want to be tempted to lose her virginity. And at one point, there are accusations that Nidar's daughter made love to Helena, made love as in wooing, not necessarily had sexual union. And in fact, what we have is Demetrius tell Helena point blank when she chases him into the forest, if you can continue to pursue me, I will do thee mischief in the woods. In other words, he's threatening to take her virginity. And yet, the play is set on May Day and the summer solstice, very pagan sexual celebrations. And we've got the donkey and the ass, who would be viewed as the most well-endowed creature in the animal kingdom. So a lot of bawdy humor there. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the things to consider with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Not necessarily done talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream, even though according to the syllabus I am, but you'll remember that we had a snow day, so that slowed us down a little bit. But we will be moving into our next comedy, which is Much Ado About Nothing. And again, ideally, though I understand life is not always ideal, you would have read Much Ado About Nothing in its entirety by the next class, even though we still have to talk about Midsummer Night's Dream and put some resolution onto it. We still need to talk about writing papers because that'll be coming up. Your first paper devoted to Shakespearean comedy, which I have due around the 25th of March after spring break. But we will be talking about papers over the next week or two so that once you feel comfortable writing a paper, you can submit it in early, certainly. But you have the option of writing about Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. And we will also watch performance about Much Ado About Nothing. So keep up with the readings to the best of your ability, understanding that, of course, we're a little bit behind schedule. And we've got multiple classes devoted to each of the dramas. So what's left is our attendance question for class, and this will be due on Wednesday, and it will in some ways give a sense of what we will talk about next class. I wanted you to identify an important quote from A Midsummer Night's Dream and to indicate why you think it's important. Obviously, there are many, many quotes that you can choose. My hope is that you will all choose different quotes so that as you read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn, that'll give you a good overview of some of the important quotes in the play. Again, I intend on talking about some of the quotes as well. So, again, for your attendance question, which will be due on Wednesday, but certainly if you need additional time, let me know. What is an important quote, in your opinion, from A Midsummer Night's Dream, and why is it important? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting some closure onto Midsummer Night's Dream, talking about paper number 1, and getting prepared for Much Ado About Nothing. Take care. Bye-bye.